Ah, my intrepid explorers of the unknown. George Booza here, the voice of Beast from X-Men, the animated series in X-Men 97. Oh, my stars and garters, an adventure awaits at the Uncanny Experience. We're commandeering the Minneapolis Club this September 28th and 29th, metamorphosing it into the Grand Xavier Institute. Join us for a symposium of panels, a mutant marketplace, esteemed celebrity meet and greets, an illustrious cosplay contest, the exclusive Hellfire Club, all followed by the after party in the mansion. Procure your tickets at theuncannyexperience.com. Together, let's leap into the boundless realms of imagination and knowledge. Get your tickets now at theuncannyexperience.com.
Bum bum bottom 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 bum bum doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 bum bum bottom bum bum doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 bum bum bottom bum bum bottom ba da da 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 ba da.
You are now in session with the Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast. I'm Lisa Gullickson.
And I'm Brad Gullickson.
And each month we evaluate a different iconic romance within the four-color realm. And in this episode, arm thyself with this enchanted shield of virtue and this mighty sword of truth, for these weapons of righteousness shall triumph over evil in our Creator Corner. We're talking to cartoonist Maurice Vellekoop about his memoir, I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, from Pantheon.
2024 has already been such an incredible year for comics, and Lisa and I recently put together our top 30 favorite comics of the year so far, and just putting that top 30 together was a challenge because we were finding we wanted to include way more than 30.
And we kind of did.
If you read to the end of our best comics of 2024 so far list, you'll discover that we cheated.
Yeah. Good thing we didn't do a ranked list, because that would have just ended in tears.
Right. And of course, with every list comes a bunch of caveats. We have not read every comic that has come out in 2024. We're also a couple of weirdos with our own weirdo tastes. But we've always seen award shows and best of lists as an opportunity for conversation, an opportunity to celebrate the things that we love. And there's been a lot to love this year. In the article, you'll probably find some comics that are not too surprising. Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees is there once again.
Transformers is there.
We're Brad and Lisa, so of course we also have to celebrate Usagi Yojimbo. You know, but seriously though, Usagi Yojimbo right now, the Crow storyline, the last issue, is one of the best issues that Stan Sakai has ever done.
It will curl your hair.
But I also like to think that our list will point people to some unique titles that maybe they haven't heard about yet.
Like Hogbook and Laser Eyes. It's a super weird and wonderful memoir, and enough people aren't talking about it. Not in our circles.
Yeah. And then you have like a book like Barda from Ngozi Ukazu, which is a DC superhero comic. But because it's a young adult book, I don't think some of the Wednesday Warrior crowd are giving it a chance or are even aware of it.
They are killing it over in the YA DC stuff. So
and like,
good.
This book in particular, like if you're a Jack Kirby fan, you have to pick up Barda because Ngozi Ukazu is a pure cartoonist like Jack Kirby. And the only other person who has written and drawn within the fourth world is Walter Simonson. So that little detail alone means we need to be paying attention as Jack Kirby fanatics.
It's only July, and we are so entirely smitten with so many books, and it is a specific type of pleasure. It's such a delight when we see someone tag us and go like, hey, guys, we bought this book because of you.
Yeah.
I mean, like, just the idea of putting books in people's hands is just like, yes.
It speaks to the booksellers in us.
Yes.
You know, we are a couple that began at a Barnes & Noble, and that's what we want to do is we want to curate, we want to celebrate, we want to make more readers.
Our podcast is just a really large end cap.
It is an end cap, or maybe a bay if we're thinking grand.
And a huge jewel on it is I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together by Maurice Vellekoop.
Yeah.
And you had the distinct pleasure of putting it in my hands and selling it to me. How did that feel?
It felt great. It felt great. You know, I was going to a press screening at the Alamo Drafthouse in Washington, D.C. on Bryant Street. And before I went to that press screening, I spun by Politics and Prose, and I was just browsing around, and the cover to this book just leapt at me. I grabbed it, I pulled it down. It's a big, fat, 500-page memoir. You crack it open, you're like, oh my God, this is a comic. I hauled it over to the Alamo. I sat in the bar waiting for the screening to begin. I ordered a margarita. I started reading. I watched the movie. I got back on the metro. I read the comic all the way back home on the train. And as I was reading it, I was like, this is a Lisa book.
Yes.
This is a comic book couples counseling book.
And when someone hands you a book and goes like, this is the book for you, that's a huge responsibility. Like, you really have to plan how you're going to respond.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a
lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure on you. It's a lot of pressure on the person giving the book too. Like, I knew it was for you, but sometimes I think I know it's for you and it's not the case. And
this is the closest we get to like dating butterflies.
Right.
Now that we've been married for 15 years, we hand each other a book and go, it's like, oh my God, I hope they like it.
But thankfully, you agreed with me.
I just fell for it. And it's one of those slow burn books where I go like, I understand why Brad gave this to me. It's kind of a slice of life. I love that. And then you go like, oh, it's interweaving these cultural references. And I do love Disney princess movies, and that's in there too. Brad's really thinking of me. And then you get to that last long section that I won't spoil right now, but the dismount on this book is such just Simone Biles, just like that's going to be my only Olympics reference, but just like it's just perfect.
Yeah, you know, I'm so glad we had this time together. It's from Pantheon. It's available now wherever fine books are sold. It is a book that I don't see in my comic book stores, right? Like Lisa and I are blessed to be surrounded by great comic book stores in the Washington, D.C. area. And for whatever reason, I don't see them carrying this one.
I know this is a local reference, but Politics and Prose feels right for this book.
Sure. Maurice Vellekoop, you know, his work has appeared in Time and The New Yorker and GQ and Cosmopolitan, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly. And I think he falls into the comics world of Chester Brown and Art Spiegelman, and not necessarily the world of Action Comics and, you know, the X-Men or whatever.
Maybe it's because I wasn't raised reading comics. Like, I didn't grow up going to the store and getting single issues, but I kind of chafe against being relegated to one section of a bookstore for my comics, or one kind of bookstore for my comics. I personally have only been rewarded for being a varied and omnivorous eater of comic books.
Yeah, I think too often we allow comic book stores or publishers to put up walls between genres or the types of comics, and we should not give them the power. We should kick those walls down and read everything. And just as I knew that you would love I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, I knew Comic Book Couples Counseling listeners would love this book as well. And it is the type of title when you get done, because you are so rocked by it emotionally, you want to become an advocate for it. You want to get this book into as many people's hands as possible. And that is just one of the many reasons why it ended up on our best comics of the year so far. We were not planning on having a conversation with Maurice Vellekoop about the book, but our friend and former guest of the podcast, Carl Stevens, I saw him on Instagram, and he had lunch with Maurice Vellekoop, and I had liked that post, and I said, oh my goodness, his latest book is so great, Carl. And then Carl messaged me and he said, is he coming on the podcast? I said, oh no, I don't have any contact information with Maurice. And Carl's like, I got you.
Yeah.
And now here we are, this week's episode with Maurice Vellekoop.
Thank you, Carl. Tell your cats I said hi.
And now our listeners are saying like, yeah, Brad and Lisa, we get it. You love this book, but why? What's it about?
What's it about so rarely is the thing that makes the book so good. But I will give you a plot synopsis. Is that what you're asking for?
Yes, thank you.
So this memoir actually covers an enormous swath of time, which generally for me, makes me wary. For me, it doesn't always come together.
Right, like a biopic is my least favorite type of movie.
But this is not that thing.
No.
This is not that thing. It opens with Maurice as a very small child being raised by a distant dad and a magical mom in this extremely separate and isolated sect of Dutch immigrants who are part of the Christian Reformed Church. And as a small boy, he was attracted to things that could be considered traditionally effeminate, where he was into Barbies and he was into Disney. And slowly he got the creeping feeling that was not okay. And so it covers him growing up gay and becoming this illustrator and finding some real success and getting to travel to Paris and get his own home. And yet this specter of dysfunction just carries through his life. No matter how distant he got from what he feels damaged him, the distance wasn't going to be the thing that fixed his life.
Yeah, and it's also about how he throws himself into art,
Yes.
into animation, into comics, and how those things can sort of rescue you from your life, but also then you can get lost in those things as well.
Maurice has a very complicated relationship with the things that made him him as a boy. And as a person who often goes to pop culture things, comics, movies, to find herself.
I mean, we built a whole podcast around that.
Yeah, like you go like, oh, is this a savior or is it a substitute?
Right,
You
yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Am I filling, some kind of undefined shaped hole with characters that don't exist?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, it's a 500-page graphic novel. It is a massive beast of a book, and it took him 11 years to create. And when you open this book up, like you have to absorb the manner in which his life is being told through the medium of comics and the style that he has created over time and how that is a result of his experiences, of his passions. There really isn't a book that looks like this one on the shelves right now.
Yeah. It's a book you really do have to submit to, where, you guys know that I'm like a copious note taker, and I like to try to figure things out, and I have a part of my brain that gets a lot of satisfaction out of I know where this is going.
Right,
You know what I
right,
melike
yeah.
Which can be a toxic impulse.
You had to remove yourself from your distant way of reading. Like you had to stop taking notes. You were preparing for this conversation. You wanted to have a massive list of questions for Maurice.
And I did.
And you did. But at some point while you were reading it, you had to put the sticky notes away.
I had to be satisfied with the idea that I wasn't going to figure it out. And once that happened,
You weren't able to figure out the book.
yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you were trying to what's the ending? I want to know the ending before I get there. You get satisfaction in calling your shot or calling the author's shot.
Yeah, I mean, that's putting it cheaply, but that is true, and that is what I said. I think the structure of this book is unique.
Yeah.
But, I think it's extremely human, and it was, one of those things where, can I just say it now? It's in the interview.
I mean, that's where we begin our conversation. We begin our conversation with the structure of this book.
So he lives his life, and we see a situation that feels like it's getting better. Oh, no, it's getting worse. It seems like he's had a breakthrough. Oh, no, he's just, he's going the wrong direction again. And then as an approaching middle-aged man, he goes to therapy. And he has a really dedicated therapist who helps him put the pieces together. And as a reader, seeing all of those disparate parts that I was holding on to and with curiosity being put together in this format. I mean, I've never really seen it done that way before. And it does give you the satisfaction of like, oh, I'm so glad I held on to these pieces because these are the pieces that helped Maurice fix his life. Not fix his life. I mean, like, find satisfaction with his life.
Yeah, and this is not the type of comic that you can spoil. Obviously, we're talking to Maurice in this episode, so Maurice is still around, thriving as a cartoonist.
Yeah.
You know, so, like, what Lisa has just discussed there isn't going to rob you any kind of pleasure in the reading.
Yeah. This book is literally unspoilable because it contains so much. It is a feat of structure. It is a feat of artistry. And it's also a feat of vulnerability. He bears himself so completely and so intimately. He experiences traumatic things. He experiences sexual things. He experiences things that are embarrassing and uncomfortable. And, like, I just can't imagine sharing my early sexual fumblings ever.
Yeah.
And the fact that he does it with such grace and such specificity. Like, this is his life.
He portrays himself very nakedly, and that is a hell of a thing, especially when you go through so much horror. We should say that there are some extremely traumatic events in this book. He is assaulted at least twice over the course of this narrative, and to revisit those moments, those horrific moments, and tell them to the reader through such a unique and sharp perspective, to me, it's a heroic act.
This conversation is just so extraordinarily precious to us because he gives so much of himself in this book.
Right.
And then for us to go to him and say, please tell us more. Right. Yeah. And he is so generous with his thoughtfulness and with his time. Like, this is one for the books. Yeah. This is a really, really special conversation.
Truly. But Lisa, before we get to it, we got to get to some
referrals.
Sponsored by Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. Just like your local comic book store, you pay per book, but digital.
Their focus is on building an excellent customer shopping and reading experience and using novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book. They feature top-tier content and already have many of the top publishers in comics today.
So, in the spirit of helping people find their next new favorite book, we have our referrals segment. The idea is to give our counselees, that's you guys, further reading on the themes of the episode. Think of it as us sending you to specialists to further your healing journey through comic books.
My referral this week refers to how you can learn things in therapy that are supposed to help you, but when you have them, you don't always know when and how to apply them. Mm-hmm. And, all you can do is go back to your life and kind of do the best you can.
Right.
And sometimes you are applying that stuff during extraordinary times and circumstances such as an apocalypse. So what popped into my mind was the first issue of Swan Songs.
A book I have not read yet.
By Maxwell Prince. And the art of chapter 1 is Martin Simmons. Maxwell Prince did Ice Cream Man, which you read, and I did not read.
Correct.
And I did not read it because Brad, as he was reading it, was going oh, I like this. Do I like this? I like it. Do I?
What's going on in Ice Cream Man is insane. It's hard to quantify in any way.
Yeah, so to me, I'm I'm not up for a challenge. But then I was seeing these beautiful covers on the shelf, and there is one that is an homage to Where the Sidewalk Ends
Right.
by Cheryl Silverstein. And I was like, no, I have to read it because that is my childhood. But the first story in Swan Songs is so beautiful. And it's about this son who has been going to therapy, and his mom is in the hospital and she is in the process of dying of kidney disease. And he is just trying to keep his mom happy and content in her death by reading to her home and garden magazines. And so it's a really short story. Like I said, it's only half of an issue, actually. And I was so extremely touched and moved by it. And in the narration, you get to watch the person process, like, you know, when I was in therapy, before my therapist died in the apocalypse, he was always saying to break things down into these digestible chunks and just kind of going through life one step at a time. And to see someone embrace that at the end of the world was just so beautiful to me.
Well, I'm taking that book to the beach. I'm going to bring my iPad with my omnibus, and I'm going to read some Swan Songs. For my referral, I'm sticking to the memoir tract. I have selected Loved and Lost from cartoonist Jeffrey Brown, who has some of that Chester Brown DNA in his cartooning as well. And we talk with Maurice about Chester Brown, or at least Chester Brown gets referenced in this conversation with Maurice. And it got me thinking about Loved and Lost. And Loved and Lost is actually a trilogy of graphic novels. It's Clumsy, Unlikely, and Any Easy Intimacy. And these three books are all about poor Jeffrey Brown trying to figure out his various relationships. And like Maurice Vellekoop, they are incredibly vulnerable, nakedly honest, and reflective. They invite conversation from the reader.
I have always loved memoirs. Like, thinking back to my Barnes and Noble days, that is like the one section where I'm like, I've read at least 3 books on each shelf. I am just dying for someone to come in and ask for a memoir recommendation because I am ready.
Yeah. And you've made me a fan of memoirs.
Yeah.
Which I am grateful for. Thank you, Lisa. Both Swan Songs and Loved and Lost are currently available on Omnibus. Omnibus is now available everywhere. If you've got an Android, if you've got an iPhone, if you have a browser, you have access to a digital comic book store. You can also now do subscriptions on Omnibus. So get your pull box on Omnibus.
Referrals. I feel like we've done a really thorough job of setting this table. We have brought out the fine china. We have lit candles. So hopefully y'all are ready for this conversation. The book is I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, a memoir. It's available now from Pantheon. And here is Maurice Vellekoop.
Maurice, welcome to Comic Book Couples Counseling. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Your book has one of the most satisfying memoir structures I have ever read because we get to follow you through your extraordinary life. And you have led a really interesting life with really amazing and interesting characters. But as I'm reading, I'm like, but what does this all mean? And then bam, you go to the therapist and you're like, this is what it all means. And was that always the plan when you were creating your memoir, to have Maggie, your therapist, be this like kind of central and pivotal character?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you know, when you're thinking about this material and planning it, you wonder about structure and should it be linear or should it be like reflective, like looking, you know, should it take place in the present day and have the character look back? And to me, it seemed like the best structure was just a linear structure, like start at the beginning and plant all of these little bombs that are going to go off later. And then, yes, very much to have Maggie be this kind of heroic savior figure who helps to untangle all of this mess.
So did you go message first? Were you like, this is what I want to say, and here are the events that take me to that place?
Yeah, I didn't think about a message particularly though, but yeah, I did think about this, like the structure of the story in that way, like that it would lead up to this period of reflection and revelation.
When I read a book, I'm always looking for like, this is my takeaway. This is the thing that I'm going to like go like, I'm applying this to my life. And for me, it was something that you used with Maggie, which was the idea of clearing away false leads. And I go like, okay, do I need to go to therapy to clear away my false leads? Is clearing away my false leads something that I can learn how to do and apply on my own? Like, what do you think? Do I need therapy? Probably.
Well, I think it's good for everybody. Even if you think that your problems are kind of minor, it can just really help to clarify things for you. Because it's a memoir, you have a certain set amount of material, and so it's a matter of like picking things really. And one of the things, like, I guess I'm giving away something for the reader, but one of the things I wanted to do as planting a false lead was to kind of suggest early on that of my two parents, my dad was like very problematic, which he was. Very volatile and angry and physical or verbally abusive sometimes. So he seemed like the obvious villain, right? And yet when I come out to him, he's quite accepting, and when I leave the church that I've grown up in, he's quite accepting. So, and then my mother's been kind of a sweet and silent figure through the whole thing, but you realize that all of the problems are connected to her. So I really wanted to, because my dad was such a character, I did want to set him up as like, oh, well, he's the guy who's causing all the problems in this guy's life. But no, it's really the central conflict is really with the mother. And so that was one of the things that I thought right from the beginning, oh, ha, 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 I can fool the audience or the readers and then come out with this much more poignant and difficult relationship with her.
And on the reread, that's what's so satisfying is when you go back to that first scene in the book where the two of you are going to the department store on Remembrance Day. That scene holds so much more weight with the totality of the book in your mind.
Right, exactly. And one of the things I wanted to do with that scene, yeah, as you say, for your listeners, like, so the book opens with me and my mother going on a trip downtown together, just she and I. And it's a very magical, suspended time for us, and we're completely in love with each other. And the reason I set it on Remembrance Day is because it's true that happened, but also because I wanted to put World War II at the center of the story right from the beginning, because my parents were Dutch immigrants. They arrived in Canada in around 1950, 51, and they had both experienced some quite traumatic things during the war, which played out intergenerationally in our family, particularly with my father, who suffered some pretty awful things during the war, which we find out later on in the book. And help kind of explain why he was so volatile. Yeah.
Was this always a comfortable experience transferring your life to the page?
Yeah, no, no, it was not. It was pretty difficult reliving some of that awful stuff. As you know, but your listeners don't probably, is that there are a couple of physical attacks upon me that happened in the book, and that was particularly painful to relive, and also to kind of aestheticize. I mean, you have to kind of present it in a clear way to the reader, and it was very challenging. Yeah, there was a lot of tears.
Yeah, I mean, I love that point there. You know, you have to tell those sequences in the aesthetics that you've already established. And I could see that being very difficult.
Yeah, because I tried to make those scenes beautiful as well. The in the first scenario, I'm walking home. It's a beautiful spring evening. It's late at night, and there's this scent of flowers in the air from the springtime, and so I wanted to capture that beauty alongside of the ugliness of what happened to me.
I noticed in the acknowledgments that you took kind of a historical approach to your life, where I like sometimes I just presume a memoirist is sitting alone and going like, well, this is my reflection on my life, my point of view. So I don't really need to ask anybody else about it. But you did go to the people in your life to, kind of give you more context and clarify and bring perhaps a truer version, or like, so you went to a more whole version. You went to your siblings, you went to your mom, you went to Martin, Paul's partner. What was that impulse to invite other people to clarify the story of your life?
Right. So the main focus of that was again on my father.
Mm-hmm.
So he was really part of that whole like 1950s generation of men who were traumatized by war and who had no understanding of psychology or getting psychological help. And so they just lived with this pain and they suppressed it, and it squished out all over their families. And so I have this line in the book, it's that generation of wait till your father gets home.
Mm-hmm.
And my addition to that is, home from the war. And so it was, I worked really hard with my therapist, Maggie, to try to understand him. But because he didn't talk about his experiences very much, and I didn't want to listen for a long time in my life because I resented him so much. I did interview my siblings to find out more about what had actually happened to him. And I felt like I needed to include that because it not only did it explain it to me, but it helps to explain it to the reader. And so there's a little bit of maybe falseness to the narrative in that sense, is that I'm relaying information to the reader that I found out only after my dad was actually dead. So, but I felt it was important for the story and for generating compassion for this guy.
Fairy tales is another beautiful through line through your book. And then the book ends like, okay, I've graduated from my therapist. I'm off my antidepressants. I'm with Gordon. And it's been 4 years. And so when I read the 4 years, I go like, is 4 years enough time to be really sure that you have it like all figured out?
Oh yeah, well, no, of course not. We don't figure things out in 4 years, no. But we have been together for 22 years now, and it's like any relationship. There's good times and bad times, and disagreements and quarrels. But we still, I would say we still have a great relationship, and we really enjoy each other, and we laugh a lot too. So I think that to me is the key. It's more important than all the other stuff.
There is this impulse in memoirs to bring it all to like a beautiful close. Like you have to go like, and from this point on in this memoir, this person was like fine. Like it was all perfect. It was wonderful. One of the lines that sticks out was something you took away from Sleeping Beauty, and how Sleeping Beauty was something of a flop. And you go like, well, how could so many people work so hard on something so beautiful just to see it fail? And it's hard to not then apply that to your life, right? You have this really rich history of, immigrant parents and them working so hard to raise you within the context of like what they knew as people. Like, is having a happy ending to this story an homage to the people who created the fairy tale that is your life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think I think it is about having accomplished that work that I did with Maggie, on myself, and also the success of this relationship. I haven't had a period of depression. We see some of the really awful depression that I lived with in the 90s. And since I've been with Gordon, I haven't had any, like, a prolonged period of depression in all those 22 years. Yeah, it is a happy ending. It's also kind of dull too. I mean, like, we don't go out that much. The biggest question is, like, that we face every day is, what are we going to have for dinner, and what movie are we going to watch tonight? Um, but it's also very reassuring, and so, yeah, after I'd been with Gordon for a while, I was still seeing Maggie, obviously, for several years after the supposed happy ending of the book, and there've been crises over the years where I've had to go back to her and get fixed up again. But yeah, at one point we were talking about the depression and about Gordon, and she said, "Well, were you depressed, or were you really just lonely?"
Yeah.
Is that's the question? That's the question. That's kind of, yeah, I think, answered by the fact that I have not experienced there's a day or two where I'm kind of like, wow, this weather really sucks and I feel lousy, but not weeks or months anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much of the book is also just about human connection and finally being able to connect to others because you're able to connect with yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you talk a little bit there about, like, the ending being somewhat mundane, but as experienced through art, your relationship, one of the things that I connected so heavily to was your relationship with art and how it helped you process your inner life, but also at times maybe it got in the way of you processing your inner life. And as a couple that uses comics to better understand themselves, we connected to that very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's this whole idea of sublimation that runs through the book, where life is too difficult, and so I retreat into making art. And so for many years, as we know, I had I had a lot of difficulty dealing with my own sexuality, and I kind of shut down for a long period just because I couldn't face it. I had a couple of bad experiences in the 90s with guys, and followed by that first assault. And this was all as the AIDS epidemic was just bursting onto the scene. And I just got overwhelmed by it all, and I couldn't face it, and I just kind of shut down. And so my sex life started to be put into making gay erotica and putting all of that sexual energy and longing into making art and books about it. So there's that.
One of the fascinating things for me also is the fact that you find comics at a very key moment too. You didn't necessarily grow up reading the funny pages the way that I did, but like Lisa, you discovered it later in life. And can you talk a little bit about when you found those Raw magazines, what about this medium unlocked the next phase of your creativity?
Yeah, so yeah, in the 80s, my experience of comics as a kid was Mad Magazine, which I loved. And I have two older brothers, and so we got a lot of heavy metal magazines around the house, and I loved all of that stuff too. But none of it seemed cool, really, to me. And when I saw the Raw magazine, I thought, oh, this is cool. And the ways that those artists used the form were so different from everyone else. And of course, Love and Rockets, we have to mention that too. I mean, that was that same era too, when they just burst into the world and changed everything as well. so yeah, they were, it was cool. Suddenly seemed cool. Comics seemed cool. And yeah, and just it really struck me that this form is just limitless in what it can explore and do. And those artists like Mark Bayer, Charles Burns, Gary Panter, and particularly a big one for me was Jerry Moriarty. Those Jack Survives comics that he did, they're just like a single page with a very banal kind of subject matter, but they're also kind of cosmic at the same time and very, very funny. And so those particularly kind of rang a bell in my head. And a lot of my early work in comics are about banal moments in life that can, like, missed connections or just getting through a day of work kind of thing. I thought, wow, the comics can look at all of this stuff.
Music has a way of kind of outlining the ineffable, right? Where it's just like, okay, I don't have words for this, but this is how it feels. And it's a sound. And I feel like with comics, sometimes we get these visual manifestations of the ineffable. And so in your book, it's the two sides of your inner voice that manifest themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in my notes, I was trying to contextualize them, and I called them the boy and the gremlin is what I ended up calling them. When did they become characters in your book? Is it something that, like, you thought about your entire life? You always had these two people inside you? Or was it, okay, this is how visually I can describe this thing? And then also, if you also had names for those two little guys, I'd be very curious to know what you called them.
Yeah. So I just called them M1 and M2. But they're kind of a little bit inspired by Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. So Thing 1 and Thing 2. And they are things. But yeah, they came out of a very real experience, though, which I do remember for a large part of my life. That everyone has an inner monologue, right? This is what we know from drama. And this is what we try to convey with drama and writing and everything, is that subtext of that inner voice, right? But I do distinctly remember two inner voices, and they bickered and argued all the time about stuff. And a lot of it had to do with guilt and what's the companion of guilt? Guilt and shame, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then I also wanted to create a book that wasn't just straightforward realism and have some weird shit in it. So I thought these characters could provide that too, a visual way of identifying these two voices and giving a character to them. And they, yeah, and then I guess we're giving stuff away again too, but at the end of the book, they kind of mesh into one, and for over 22 years now, I only experience one inner voice now, and it's not always arguing. It's more reflective, and I guess more like a normal inner voice.
I always wonder, like, when a person creates a memoir and they go like, this is the story of my life, like, is this the definitive story of your life? Or could you pull some other thread of life lessons and write a completely other memoir that runs parallel to this one? You know what I mean? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. Yeah, I think you could. But yeah, I'm not gonna.
You're not gonna.
No, there's the first draft was just just a big fat mess, because this is my first time doing a long form piece on such a scale. The longest comic I wrote before this 500-page book was 10 pages. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot to learn in the first year of working on this project after I'd made a deal with Pantheon and I got my first Canada Council grant. So yeah, I spent a lot of time learning about writing, And I also live with an editor who's very, very experienced and is, you know, really skillful at just like nailing the problems with a scene or what have you. So yeah, where was I going with this? Another. Oh yeah, so
Draft, yeah.
the first draft ended with a long, long discussion of Wagner's Tannhäuser.
Okay, yeah.
Which I really identify with. It's kind of the story of my life. It's about an artist who's torn between his religious side and his carnality, his sexual being, and he's just torn apart by it. And it never fails to leave me just like a weeping wreck. At the end of each act, like the 3 acts, each one is just like, they just kill me because I identify with him so much. But maybe not the greatest finale for a for a memoir. And so that got ejected, and that I think could reemerge as an essay, maybe someday.
I would be curious to read it. I would.
Okay, cool.
Genuinely.
Cool.
As an opera not fan. We discussed it before. I'm not a fan, but I do know it very well because it is what I studied in school. So I would be curious to read it.
Sure. Well, I would love to do it someday because it had a lot of pictures of drawings of singers that I love and productions of the opera over that various directors' takes on it, because to me it's so rich and deep that it can sort of bear a lot of like messing with, and opera production nowadays, particularly in Europe, really messes with the text and the intentions of the composer. I think this is Tannhäuser is one of those operas that can really withstand it because it's so abstract. The idea of it is so abstract.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you learned about this medium and the telling of such a large tale?
Yeah, so I learned an awful lot over the 11 years that it took to make this. My career mostly was as an illustrator for magazines and advertising, and so I learned a lot of tricks that I could use that I got. I used them so much that they got a little bit musty, I think. And the challenges that creating this book presented challenged all of those tricks that I could use. So for example, I really had to learn how to draw people in profile and 3/4 a lot of the time. That was really, really challenging, and get the likeness of the person, so that alone was one giant challenge. Then of course there's the continuity, the script girl, that they have in the movies. I had to be the continuity girl and the script girl, and then all of the locations and everything. I really came to rely on Google Street View. Became my best friend during the making of this, because of course you can visit your childhood home and kind of see it from every angle and stuff. And I learned an awful lot about constructing scenes and all of this stuff above.
Were there limitations found in this medium? Did you find things that the comic could not do that you wanted it to do?
Not really. I mean, so I spent a lot of time on the script. I spent about a year just writing the script, because I didn't want to just begin and wind up making art that I wasn't going to use. So that really was the most challenging thing, was writing that script. And so as I was writing it, I could visualize what I wanted to say. And then as I worked on it, making the art, I realized that I could delete some of the text because the images were strong enough to tell the story on their own. So for example, the ending of part 3, I think, is part 3 is the scene of me having kind of a nervous breakdown in Bavaria, in the King Ludwig II's castle, Neuschwanstein. And so that final image of that page is just me kind of sobbing and just surrounded by all of these images of all of the awful things that have happened in my life. It just kind of sums everything up to that point. And it's just a picture without words.
That was one of my most satisfying page turns in the book, was of course turning to your emotional breakdown, but then going to the next chapter, because you go like, oh man, he's had this emotional breakthrough, now he's really getting somewhere. And then you turn the page and you discover, oh, he has taken all the exact wrong lessons he should have taken from that instance. Like that is like of all of the false leads, the New York scenes were my favorite.
Oh, great. Oh, I love to hear that.
You were just going really hard in the wrong direction.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a mess, isn't it?
It is a mess, but then
and that therapist in New York, oh, she's so dreadful. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I had a negative experience with therapy when I was a teen, and I felt like I took all of the wrong lessons. To me, like the lesson I took from therapy, because she was about to go on maternity leave, and so she was trying to get to the bottom of something with some kind of urgency, you know, and also like the emotional state I was in also called for some urgency as well. They couldn't find that core central problem. There just wasn't the time. So the message I took from my experience with therapy was like, you have no reason to feel this way. Like your life is so good and easy. And what is your problem? But I love how because of the revelations you had from going hard in the wrong direction, it never felt like wasted time. Do you like look at your time in New York as wasted time, or do you look at it as like, oh, well, you had to go there?
Yeah, I think exactly what you said. I had to try it. You know, as I wrote, like I was just so fed up with Toronto. I knew it so well, and I was sick of all my friends and my family. And I thought, if I just launch out onto this completely new adventure, everything's going to be great. And of course, it was one of the worst times of my life. And but yeah, I think it was something I needed to do just to shake things up. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go back in time a little bit and imagine a world in which this book of yours was placed in your hands, like not necessarily your life, but a book like this one given to you at a young age. Can you imagine how it would have impacted you?
You know, one hopes that one might be receptive. But I don't know. Do you remember this whole "It Gets Better" movement that happened a few years ago? Dan Savage, whom I really admire and respect, started this movement where people, older gay people, would sort of supposedly reach out to younger people and tell them that their life, even though it might be hell right now, will get better. And I kind of didn't really buy that because, and then I was asked to write a piece about this very subject for an anthology, and it was people writing letters to their younger selves, and explaining this very thing, that, you know, you may not believe it now, but one day you will be, you know, a famous illustrator who's beloved by the world, and you'll have a loving partner. And it just struck me that no, that would not help at all to hear that when you were 16 and you're getting, you know, called faggot all day long at high school, and you're just, you know, afraid all the time, and you can't tell anyone about it. I don't see how that would really help. So in my piece, I actually show my younger self getting the letter and like reading it and then tearing it up and throwing it in the garbage. And the editors were like, "Oh, really? You really want to do that?" And my gorgeous partner said, you know, I was kind of faltering, and I was kind of like, well, maybe I should write a softer, gentler piece. And he's like, well, no, if that's what you believe, then you should absolutely write that. And so I kind of fought for it, and so my piece ends up being the only kind of negative or questioning of this whole endeavor in the book.
I think that's so important though, because it's just like, especially if you're experiencing some kind of depression, like the existence of a future is not persuasive at all anyway, because
No,
like you're living your present, you're full-time living in your present.
absolutely. Yeah.
One of the moments that kind of had me looking at the book entirely differently was when you were working on your erotic ABC book and how you were going back and redrawing stuff, because by the time you got to a certain letter, you had some kind of growth as an artist, and oh no, I have to go back and redraw those opening pages. And so then all of a sudden I find myself kind of looking at the beginning of the book and looking at the end of the book and going, oh, the saturation has changed a little bit. Like, super brave to put that in there, because like it does make the person like hyper aware of like, okay, well, this is kind of a follow-up to that thing. Was that something you were concerned about creating this? You talked about script continuity, but artistic continuity of going like, well, do all of the pages reflect me as an artist in totality right now?
And taking 11 years to tell this story,
Yeah.
A lot changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I just tried not to think about it too much. And actually, at the beginning, I was going to do the book in an entirely different style. And I had actually created a couple of chapters in this different style. Like I was trying to actually work without black outlines. And I had a meeting with Chester Brown, and he said, Maurice, you're attempting this giant thing. Maybe it's a good idea to just remain with the style that you've perfected over all these years. And at that point, I really realized that he was right. And so I went back and redid the chapters in my traditional black outline with color style. And yeah, and then as I was working on it, of course, I tried to make it consistent. But I also tried to resist that perfectionist voice in my head a little bit too. And just, so yeah, a typical day of work, which is still a typical day of work today, is that, I like to get to work at 9, and mornings are my best productive time. And so by noon, I'm really high on caffeine, and I just think I'm God's gift to the world. And then by the end of the day, you think, oh, this is all terrible. And then you kind of go, well, I did my best. Just move on to the next thing. And that's what I experience literally every day. Even working on, I did a commercial illustration last week, and it was just a roller coaster the whole day long. Is this thing gonna work? If I put this color here, is that gonna wreck everything? And it's only at the very end that it's just this kind of relief that comes into you, like, oh, it did work well enough, and just you have to meet the deadline and send the thing off.
So here you are now, 11 plus years later, after starting this epic tome of a book about you, putting your life onto the page. It has to be a very strange sensation then to hand it off to the reader to finish the story. The book is on the shelves. How do you feel now?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of feelings. There's, definitely some panic sometimes. People obviously know a great deal about me now and about my sex life and stuff like that too. And so, yeah, it sort of veers from pride to panic to just thinking of it as putting like a kind of a gift out into the world, the gift of this story, and a lot of pain. So I think maybe that's the one that wins out the most, is just thinking of it as a gift,
This book being the logical conclusion to the life lesson of like, it costs to compartmentalize, right? To not share every part of yourself with your mother made it so that you couldn't share every part of yourself with the world. And so the idea of going like, okay, well, now all of the walls are down. Everybody gets to read my story. But like, I am also a person who was raised religious, and I still super depend on my compartments, where I like one of my things that I always say defensively is like, well, you know, why have a conversation where nobody's going to change their mind? You know what I mean? I do have that thing of like, don't hurt mom at all costs. And I don't know, do you still have compartments? Do you still find yourself relying on compartments in certain ways, or do you feel comfortable going like, okay, here's a stranger, let's talk about my sex life or whatever?
Yeah, I think I still have compartments. The yeah, it's that's a big question. One thing that comes to mind when we talk about this is just the, you know, the force of that religious upbringing. Of course, it stays with you, right? And once in a while, a hymn will come back to me, and I'll just like sing a whole hymn to Gordon,
Yeah.
who grew up like actually in a devoutly atheistic house. So he doesn't get any of it. And then I'll just be in tears because the hymn, some of those hymns are so beautiful, you know, and they're in you. They're like embedded in you from childhood. And then I just start to think about all of those sweet people, you know, the people my parents' age, like don't really mean any harm to you, and yet have been complicit in this, you know, total screwing up of your life by this thing that you experienced together. And of course, you know, whenever you see these old dollies now, is at a funeral, if an aunt or an uncle dies, that's when you see them, and that's when you sing the hymns again. So it's intensely moving. And it goes back to Tannhäuser too, because Tannhäuser comes from this Christian community, and he knows he can't go back to it, but the longing is so great. And when his friends convince him to return to the community, it's a disaster, of course, and he's actually killed by it in the end. So it's all very deep. So you kind of have to lock it away. But then, you know, when I say that too, I also that I've never been troubled by religious questioning ever since I was 18. Like when those letters lift off the page of the Bible, that was kind of it for me. And I've been just so happy to not really even think about it or worry about it, or even my cousin asked me, aren't you worried about what's going to happen after you die? And I'm like, no, I'm not. I don't really think about it. And it's just like, how could you live with, like, how could you build your faith around the fear of what was going to happen to you after you were dead? You know, like the implication being like, you know, I'm gonna be religious because I'm afraid of going to hell. You know?
Yeah.
Like, it's so absurd. So that part of it for me has been just kind of serene ever since I was 18 and I left the church. I was just like, yeah, I'm quite happy to just not think about it.
So I did have a similar thing where I actually felt a lot of peace from like, okay, I'm not going to be judged super harshly like for every other decision that I made, or any one decision can't cancel out my value. And there was like a burning down of the house, you know, where I go like, okay, like this part of my life is, you know, over, like I've burned down the house. But then I do find myself going back in the house and like blowing the ashes off of stuff and going like, oh, but this is still so pretty. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and then, you know, things like Handel's Messiah too. I mean, probably not your favorite, but I, you know, because my mother used to play that on Sunday mornings to get us up to go to church. And so, you know, I still listen. I mean, I loved it as a child and as a grown up too. It's got that extra layer um, beauty and movingness for me because of that connection with her.
So I don't want to end this conversation without talking a little bit about Disney, because
Okay.
one of the side effects of this book is it did send me back to revisiting early Disney films, and I read a biography of sorts, or a nonfiction work about the creation of Disneyland that I then became immediately obsessed with
Mm.
right after reading your book. I'm curious what your relationship is right now with Disney, with the big D.
Yeah, it's really complicated, isn't it? I mean, the more you learn about him as a person, the sort of more repellent he becomes, and then I'm not interested in any of the animated films that were created after I guess after the 70s, really.
Mhm.
So there's that. None of it interests me. I never liked The Little Mermaid even. Just thought,
Aw.
yeah,
I was a 90s kid, so like Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, like was my entire
So
childhood.
just cover your
Or
ears
cover
right
my
now.
ears.
yeah, yeah. It is really vast and complicated, though, isn't it? Um, s- and so yeah. Um, and I've never been to Disneyland or Disney World.
Okay.
Actually, it doesn't really interest me anymore. But I do love revisiting the really classic animated films from time to time. And Sleeping Beauty really does knock me out, even though it's a really bad movie. It's so badly written, and she's just so uninteresting, and so is the prince, and so are the all the other like lead characters except for Maleficent. But the beauty of the drawing and the gorgeousness of the backdrops and everything, and just that thing of when I finally, this was my life's mission, was to see this film, right? All through, we get that right from the beginning practically of the book, and I had to wait till I was 22 before it was re-released in theaters in the 80s. And so it had never occurred to me that it was in such a widescreen format before. So we get into the theater and the screen is like, um, whatever that Cinerama or whatever the format is. And I was just like, oh, I never realized this. So yeah, that continues to hold fascination for me. And we just watched Fantasia again too, which was incredible. But also I saw some really bad drawing in it too. So it's funny, these are lifelong things that we kind of, our opinions and feelings change, and sometimes they change back again too.
Yeah, I mean, what I found through your book was that it did justice to my memory of those animated films. And I found a connection to them through your work in a way that I don't even necessarily have watching the films today.
Yeah. It's like I wish there wasn't so much Disney in the book, because it's so complicated, and because of all of the ugly things again that Disney did, like trying to break up the strikers and everything in the 40s, and
which is the direct link to Disneyland. Disneyland exists because of that strike.
So yeah, because he lost interest in animation, right? Because of those damn animators, those damn artists. And so yeah, I wish it wasn't so, but unfortunately it did. It was very formative to me, and I had to acknowledge it. There was no choice about it. I wish I didn't have to, but I had to.
I'm glad that you did, because I have very complicated feelings similar to yours about Disney, and I cannot shake the love I have for it.
Yeah, there is like sometimes when you're a fan, you all of a sudden feel responsible for the person, which isn't fair. Like Wagner, not a full-time great guy either. You know
No.
what I mean? But
Nor
less
any of
people
us.
are aware, like, unless people are aware what a problematic individual he was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To me, what I love about the way you use Disney was there were other lessons that you were taking from the existence of these films that were entirely separate from the film itself. Like the line that I already mentioned, like, oh my God, so many people worked on this thing. Like
Yeah.
it takes so many people to create a fantasy. And it takes so many people to create something that also fails. And yeah, like the way that we speak about art so much, we sometimes get fixated on the art, but what we are actually talking about is ourselves. Like when you talk about Tannhauser, you're talking about yourself. And when you're talking about Disney, you're talking about yourself. And yeah, and you're not responsible for Disney. I give you permission to love Disney as much as you want, and don't be
Sure, sure. And
embarrassed.
then there's the whole thing of the actual animators, many of whom were lovely people. Like I don't know if you ever watched that documentary about the two friends, the lifelong friends. I forget their names right now. You know, two of the top animators during that golden era of like the 40s through to the 70s, I guess. And they just are such sweet guys, very simple, and all they wanted to do was pour their love into this art form, and they created some of the most moving scenes in Disney. Like the Jungle Book for me is like, to me it's the greatest Disney film, just because it's so smart the way that Disney actually said, don't read the book. This is about a kid who needs to get home. That's it. That's all you need to know. And that was so smart. And then just the characters and the matching of the voices with the characters, they had such richness to draw on in those days in terms of that. But what I'm getting at is just the love that is apparent on the screen in that film.
Yeah.
I'm actually getting a little choked up talking about it.
Love that. We'll have to include the outro, the name of those friends, because I can't.
A lot of Brad's ego is attached to remembering names of things. He was raised as a nerd. I was not.
Maurice, thank you so much for hanging out with us today and talking about your beautiful book. I feel like we could spend all day talking about it because there is so much to dig there. There's so much life on display. And Lisa used the word brave earlier, I kind of hate using that in describing art sometimes, like it's such a brave thing.
But what we mean is vulnerable.
But it's something that I could not do as I am right now. So I'm impressed by it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really lovely talking to you. You guys are so charming and delightful. And I really appreciate you helping to amplify the book.
We're not going to stop talking about it. We loved it so much. And we're going to be talking about it all year long.
All year long.
And taking it with us in our hearts.
Thank you very much. I'm touched.
First things first, the animators that Maurice is talking about are Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, and the documentary is Frank and Ollie, which is now streaming on Disney+.
I have an outstanding piece of business. In this conversation, Maurice says that I probably don't like Handel's Messiah. And I do like Handel's Messiah.
And you didn't cut him off.
Before the conversation started, I talked about how I was a music major and an opera major, and there's a ton of opera in this book. And I said that I was never a fan of it.
Yeah, I wish we had gotten all of that on mic.
And when I said, and when you tell someone, oh, I'm not a fan, it sounds like I don't like the sound of that music in my ears. And that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say was I never felt that compulsion to immerse myself in it, like when I was into musical theater as a kid, or when I went to middle school and I got obsessed with the Monkees and the Beatles, but mostly the Monkees, you know what I mean? Where there's this thing about being a fan where you just kind of fold it into your identity and you go like, well, this is part of me now.
Right.
And as much as I loved opera and I love the sound of opera and I love the singing of opera, and I love the challenge of singing in that style and with that massive drama and all of that stuff, it never became me. And
Yeah.
and like I feel like Maurice was talking about how he could not take the Disney-ness out of his story, where it's just like, well, you know, I was a fan and that became me.
Yeah, I was shaped by Disney.
And there's no getting away from it.
Right, right. And even though he now looks upon Disney with very different eyes than he did when he was a child, he can't deny the Disney that affected him as a child, right? And I can't really explain why his book, I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, then propelled me on this odyssey that I have been on for the last 2 months. I went from his book to Richard Snow's expose on Disneyland, the insane construction, like how the animators' strike led to Disney like washing his hands of animation and focusing all his attention into building this small town America that never really existed. And then I went from that book to the Walt Disney biography from Neil Gabler, and you see this little boy who had some artistic talent. He goes off to France just as World War I is concluding. He joins the ambulance corps. He sees the world. He comes back. He discovers the concept of animation, and he thinks this is the new medium. Mm-hmm. We can do incredible stories with animation. I'm going to prove to the world that animation is legit. And somewhere along that mission, he loses himself and he loses that little creative boy. But it doesn't matter because he reshapes America through Mickey Mouse. It's such an American story, and as such, it's filled with, you know, beauty and magic and just grotesque horror. And while I've been devouring that book, Lisa and I have been watching Pinocchio and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. We, for the first time, watched the Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons and Mickey Mouse and Plane Crazy. Those shorts are amazing.
They are hilarious.
They are so funny. They are so surreal. They are wicked. And they are clever.
And Walt Disney was being a dick the whole time in a myriad of ways. And it goes, like, mentally, I keep going back to the way that boy Maurice talked about Sleeping Beauty and going, like, how could so many people work on something for it to fail or for it to not be beautiful?
And it did fail. Like, that's the thing we also forget. Like, those early Disney animated films, they were struggling. Sleeping Beauty, not a hit.
And there were people worried about them the whole time. And now they are these precious, exalted things. And, like, just as I turn that over in my mind of, like, how can people work so hard on something to see it fail? Like, I look at our country and our planet and human beings' very existence. And we are all working at it so hard. And I just hope that someday we'll look back and go like, you know, Sleeping Beauty was pretty okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a lot.
I also like that point you make with Maurice that you can take stories and you can learn things from the books that are, or from stories, from narrative that are independent of that narrative.
Yeah. When you watch a film or you read a book, you are finishing that story, and the thing that you make inside of yourself from that story is yours. And there's nothing that can take that away from you. It can certainly be spoiled. You can find out something about the making of that thing that turns you on that thing and you can't love it the same way anymore. But the way it changed your life at that time is your thing. You know what I mean?
And I think you were trying to give permission to Maurice to love Disney again.
Right.
And he was like, no, thanks. Which is fine.
Valid.
Yeah. Art is made by humans, and humans are gonna human. And that's going to bring us to the end of this week's episode. Coming up next week, we are going to be joined by one half of another really rad podcast group, Manga Splaining. Deb Aoki and Christopher Woodrow Butcher join us to discuss Search and Destroy, a manga that they are partnering with Fantagraphics to publish, which is really some amazing podcast goals.
If you are like us, frantically preparing for San Diego Comic-Con, we have put together an amazing list of tips and tricks for surviving San Diego Comic-Con with contributions from SDCC devotees, artists, writers, publicists, podcasters, and journalists. We spoke with our buddy Daniel Warren Johnson about this, Gail Simone, Heidi McDonald, and so many others. And I am so tremendously proud of how many cool people shared their little tidbits with us. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I am too. Links in the show notes for that article, as well as our best comics of the year so far. And don't forget that we will be screening Atomic Blonde at the Alamo Drafthouse in Winchester, Virginia on August 18th, which is also my birthday.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Brad, I just have to say, I am so glad we had this time together. I am tugging my left ear. Where can our listeners send their words of affirmation to you?
You can find me on most social medias at MouthDork. If you have words of affirmation for our logo, you can send them to Aaron Prescott at A Cool Hand Fluke. And if you have some words of affirmation for our radical banner art and show posters, send them to Karen Chapp at Karen_X-Men fan. Lisa, where can our listeners send their words of affirmation to you?
I'm always accepting words of affirmation at Sidewalk Siren on Instagram and Twitter. If you'd like to spend more quality time with us, you can subscribe to us on Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you choose. We are everywhere. If you'd like to get exclusive, you can join our Patreon, where you'll get more content, including weekly bonus episodes.
If you'd like to reach out and touch us electronically, you can email the podcast, cbccpodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit the website, comicbookcouplescounseling.com, or you can follow us on all the socials at CBCC Podcast.
You can give us a gift of 5 stars on Audible or Apple Podcasts, and if you'd like to do an act of service, why not write a review of the show while you're there?
Yes, please.
We are fluent and receptive in all 5 love languages. It really warms our hearts and helps the pod.
So until next time, friends, keep your love tank full.
And your psychic rapport open.
Doopy doopy. Bum bum ba da bum bum ba da ba.